Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into one of aviation's most chilling unresolved mysteries. And honestly, we're going to look at the fatal technological limitations that actually made it possible. We are talking about a case where a commercial airliner seemingly evaporated into thin air. No wreckage, no trace, and absolutely zero answers. So let's dive right in.
We've got to start with this number right here, 54. That is the number of human souls, 49 passengers and 5 crew members who boarded what was supposed to be a completely routine, everyday domestic flight on August 25, 1989. These were real people, stepping onto Pakistan International Airlines Flight 404, just expecting a standard trip from Gilgit down to Islamabad.
And at first, everything was perfectly standard. The plane took off right at 7:36 a.m. The pilot maintained direct, totally normal communication with air traffic control. Then, a few minutes into the flight, the pilot radioed in this completely mundane update. He just said, "We are approaching Bungee." There was no panic in his voice, no mention of mechanical failure, no distress call whatsoever. It was literally just a standard position check.
But let's break down the timeline of these final minutes because it really paints a picture of the impossible. So Flight 404 departs at 7:36 a.m. That final super calm transmission comes in at 7:44 a.m. We're talking about a window of just 8 or 9 minutes. If you do the math based on how fast the aircraft was moving, the plane had covered roughly 70 to 75 kilometers. After 7:44 a.m., air traffic control repeatedly tried to reach the pilot, but there was just silence. Despite having crystal clear communication mere moments before, the aircraft simply ceased to exist on the map. No response, no mayday call at all. To figure out how a massive aircraft simply vanishes on August 25, 1989, we are going to look at 4 key areas: navigating the death zone, the 1980s radar blind spot, geopolitics and crash theories, and the unsolved mystery itself.
Part 1. Navigating the Death Zone, the Deadly Valleys of Gilgit.
The sheer scale of this terrain is honestly staggering. Gilgit Airport is entirely boxed in by towering mountains. We're talking peaks like Nanga Parbat and Changra Hill that shoot up over 26,000 feet, completely capped with snow all year round. Planes leaving Gilgit don't just fly over these mountains. They literally can't. Instead, pilots have to carefully weave their way through this incredibly deadly, narrow maze of deep valleys.
Now, Flight 404 was a Fokker F-27, and shortly after takeoff, it's traveling at about 460 kilometers per hour. Think about that for a second. At that speed, navigating a tight valley corridor leaves you a margin of error of absolute zero. There is a designated safe route, sure, but right next to it are these massive red danger zones. One single navigational mistake, just one slight misunderstanding of where you are in the clouds, and the plane would instantly slam into a sheer wall of rock and ice.
The stakes in this environment were incredibly high, and fate played a wild role that day. Get a load of this detail from our sources. A Canadian geography researcher named David Butts actually had a ticket for Flight 404, but at the very last minute, a friend told him to skip the flight. They said bad weather often delayed planes there and advised him to just hire a Jeep to Islamabad instead. So he traded his plane ticket for a Jeep ride, and by pure unbelievable luck, he avoided the disaster entirely.
Part 2. The 1980s radar blind spot.
Okay, so if the plane is flying at high speeds through these treacherous valleys, you're probably wondering, why couldn't air traffic control just look at their screens, track the plane, and see exactly where it went down? Well, this explainer really centers on the technical challenges of radar tracking in mountainous terrain back in the 1980s. At the time, air traffic control relied on primary surveillance radar, or PSR. Think of PSR kind of like throwing a tennis ball against a wall in the pitch dark and waiting to catch it. The radar tower sends out a high-frequency radio signal. That signal hits a physical, solid target like an airplane and bounces right back to the tower. The tower reads that returning echo, and bam, it plots the plane's location on a screen.
But let's walk through exactly how this massive, mountainous terrain completely broke that system. Step 1, the tower sends out the radar signal. All good. But Step 2, instead of hitting the airplane, the signal smashes right into a 26,000-foot mountain of solid rock. Step 3, the signal just bounces back from the mountain itself. Which brings us to Step 4. Any airplane flying in the valley behind that mountain remains completely invisible. The radar system simply cannot see through solid rock.
So here is the terrifying reality. The exact second that Flight 404 dipped behind those mountain peaks to navigate the valleys, the radar screens at air traffic control essentially went blind. Because of this massive technological failure of 1980s line-of-sight radar, controllers had absolutely no idea if the plane was maintaining the safe route or if it had accidentally veered off into the deadly mountain zones. They were literally blind to the aircraft's actual location.
Contrast that with what we have today. Modern aviation uses ADS-B technology. This relies on GPS satellites looking down from high above, so it's entirely unobstructed by the terrain below. But back in 1989, even secondary surveillance radar, where the plane actively transmits its own data back to the tower, wasn't mandatory. That didn't happen until 1996, so this disappearance was heavily dictated by the technical limits of an era where line-of-sight radar hit a literal wall of impenetrable geography.
Part 3. Geopolitics and Crash Theories.
Because the plane vanished into a radar blind spot, investigators had zero hard data. They were totally in the dark, so they were forced to rely on theories to try and piece together what happened up in those mountains. Based on our source material, two heavily debated theories emerged to fill that massive vacuum left by the radar failure. We're going to look at both of these neutrally to understand the historical context. Theory number 1 is a high-altitude glacier crash. Theory number 2 involves a potential military interception near the Indian line of control. Let's break these down.
Theory 1, the glacier crash theory, really comes down to the brutal physics of the environment. If the plane veered even slightly off course at 460 kilometers per hour, it would hit a mountain instantly. There would be absolutely no time for the pilot to radio a distress call, which perfectly explains the sudden silence. Plus, when a plane hits deep snow at that speed, the burning jet fuel rapidly melts the surrounding ice. The theory suggests that the entire wreckage could have simply melted its way deep into a glacier, sinking out of sight and burying the evidence forever.
And you know what really backs up this high-altitude theory? The total lack of witnesses. There were small settlements located lower down the mountains, along the River Indus and near Bungie. If the plane had crashed in those lower valleys, the folks living there would have definitely heard or seen something. An explosion, smoke, something. But they reported absolutely zero sightings and zero sounds. The plane definitely never made it down to the populated areas. Then there's the second theory, which was highly prominent in the media and in government statements at the time, the espionage theory. Flight 404 was last tracked heading roughly toward the highly contested line of control between Pakistan and India. Historically, Fokker F-27s were occasionally used for regional surveillance missions, and given the extreme political tensions of the era, suspicions immediately arose that the plane accidentally crossed into Indian airspace and was shot down by the military. Now, we're presenting this purely as the historical theory it was, one that was born out of intense regional conflict and, again, a total lack of radar data.
Part 4. An unsolved aviation mystery. No matter which theory you look at, the immediate aftermath was absolutely agonizing. The search operation was massive. The second the plane went missing, helicopters were deployed, spending hours and hours circling the peaks, but they found nothing. And despite those intense geopolitical tensions we just talked about, India actually sent their own jets to help look for the plane. For 2 solid months, the Pakistani military and local civilians scoured this incredibly hostile, freezing terrain on foot. And the result? Absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no smoke, not a single trace.
Ultimately, the search turned up empty. Just under 2 months later, on October 13, 1989, PIA and the government officially declared that Flight 404 had crashed and that all 54 passengers and crew members had perished. The Prime Minister at the time, Benazir Bhutto, officially closed the case.
But you know, for the families left behind, an official piece of paper is definitely not closure. Decades later, because the government never actually determined a definitive cause, whether it was a tragic accident or a military strike, and because no compensation was ever provided, the families of the victims still completely reject the government's official stance. For them, the wound is still wide open. Successive governments have never reopened the investigation. To this day, Flight 404 remains Pakistan Aviation's greatest mystery.
And that leaves us with a pretty lingering thought. We know the 1980s radar blind spot doomed the search for Flight 404, but it makes you ask, have satellite tracking and modern radar truly made it impossible for a plane to simply vanish behind a mountain today? We love to think our modern tech makes us invincible, but cases like MH370 remind us that if a plane's tracking systems go dark, the vastness of nature can absolutely still swallow an aircraft whole. It kind of makes you wonder, what other mysteries are hiding out there, just out of sight?